Hi everyone, I am Saniya Kule and this is cute little Yangshi. Aw, he's saying hi. Rock on.
And in this video, we'll be talking to you guys about probability thresholds and false negative and false positive mistakes. What do those mean? And how can we interpret them, be in anything like in coronary heart disease or any disease in general? How can we interpret those? We'll talk about how predictive models give out predicted probabilities of having the disease, but ultimately we use our predicted probabilities that we get along with our probability thresholds to decide about our predictions. Does somebody have the disease? Are they positive, or do they not have the disease? Are they negative? And how we can ultimately land up with correct predictions like true positive or true negative, or incorrect predictions like false positive and false negative. But we'll be focusing here mainly on the probability thresholds and what that says, as we vary them between 0 and 1, about how we weigh false negative and false positive. I do have other videos out there that are prepared on my playlist on probability thresholds, decision curve analysis, so please do subscribe and see those. But in this video, I hope that it will be very helpful for you guys to learn more about the machine learning model overview and how we can get more insights about preferences based on a probability threshold, because it's not always 50% the default, especially in medical settings. So I hope that you guys will find this video helpful.
So I just want to quickly review the two types of errors that we are discussing, the type 1 error, false positive, and type 2 error, which is a false negative. So a false positive is wrongly predicting that someone who actually does not have the disease or condition is instead positive, that they have the disease or condition. So here, the doctor here is predicting you're pregnant. Yeah, that's exactly how you should feel, right? Like if you're him, you should be feeling scared, right? Oh my gosh, I'm pregnant, right? So the doctor's predicting that this patient is positive, is pregnant, but the truth is this patient is not pregnant. So predicting that this negative patient is instead positive, that's a false positive, wrongly predicting someone has a condition when they do not have it. So the false negative, or the type 2 error, is the doctor is predicting that this patient here, she's not pregnant, when in reality she is pregnant. So it's wrongly predicting that someone who actually has the disease or condition, the condition of pregnancy here, is negative, that they don't have it. So false negative is falsely saying, hey, you don't have the condition, you're not pregnant, but in reality you actually are. And these are mistakes, Tuggle. Falsely predict someone who's not pregnant is pregnant, a false positive, or falsely predict that someone who is pregnant is instead not pregnant. False positive errors may not necessarily be the same as false negative errors. Wrong diagnoses can have various effects, and not all errors are created equal. So before we continue, I just want to give us a quick recap of what we've covered so that you can better understand what we will be covering and building on in this video. So the videos are in my bio and on playlists, so again, please do subscribe to those. He agrees. Yeah. So just a quick recap, Yangshi, of all the stuff that we kind of have covered that we'll be building on in this video. So, as a quick recap, Tring Tring, a blast to the past. Aww. Okay, now you don't see it, now you do. Okay, great. So basically, one of the things I talked about is how we can classify outcomes from machine learning models. We have two outcomes to predict, no disease or having disease. And we can use machine learning models trained on patient data, like these type of machine learning models. Whatever they output a predicted probability, we basically put it through a filter then. And then we predict that a patient does not have a disease if their predicted probability is less than a threshold probability, and that they have the disease if the predicted probability of them having the disease based on their patient data and our machine learning model is greater than or equal to a threshold probability. Usually the default is 50%, but this is sort of what we're learning. What if we change the probability threshold? I've sort of explained this in the previous video, so please do see this for more details. But the idea is we're predicting no disease, negative class, versus positive, having the disease. Then we also talked about how machine learning models lead to clinical decision making for patients based on these probability thresholds. So basically, the idea is who wins the tug of war when we're looking on two sides for probability threshold. Either we can go for treatment, and these little ones are pulling in that direction, and if we're going for treatment, they win if the predicted probability of being positive, of being in the class that needs treatment, is greater than or equal to some probability threshold, PT. If the probability that the individual or patient here is positive is greater than or equal to a threshold, then you're predicted as being positive, and then you need to go for treatment. Otherwise, you're being predicted as negative, and then these guys win if the predicted probability for a patient being positive is less than the threshold. They're predicted as being negative. Where I sort of showed you the overall pipeline again, from input for machine learning model for patient Pucci, how machine learning model is learning from the data to predict a probability of having the disease, that Pucci has the disease, how the doctor decides based on the threshold probability, predicts positive if the probability of predicted probability is greater than or equal to a threshold, predict positive, and predict negative if the predicted probability is less than the threshold, and how based on the unknown truth, if the patient Pucci ends up being positive, how the results can be true positives or false negatives, or if Pucci instead is negative, actually healthy, does not have the disease, then the same predictions can be false positive and true negatives respectively. So we talked about this. We also talked about how the predicted probability from the machine learning model, what it outputs, and how the probability thresholds, how they can impact the outcomes that we observe. If we want to change the outcomes that we have, if being correct, either being a true positive or a true negative, or incorrect, false positive or false negative. The two main parts of where we can control this is in building a stronger machine learning model that outputs predicted probabilities of having the disease that are higher, like close to 1 for people who have the disease, and really small, close to 0 for people without the disease. And that's one way to control this, looking at the predicted probabilities. And then the second is from the probability thresholds, basically making sure that, if you vary the probability threshold, then based on any predicted probability, what you will end up predicting for a patient can change. You can predict negative, no disease, basically, if patient Pucci's predicted probability is less than the threshold, and positive, having the disease, if the predicted probability is greater than or equal to the threshold. I'll be kind of talking to you about what this threshold probability kind of means and how we can sort of tell our way that we value the different types of mistakes just based on this threshold, PT. These are the two spots where we can kind of hone in on these type of errors, if it's correct or incorrect based on these outcomes. So again, if it's negative, then we could land up with either we could land up with a false negative or a true negative. But if it's positive, then we can land up with, a false positive or a true positive based on our predictions. But we'll be talking all about honing on that in this video, and kind of what this threshold probability means. And we can talk about a specific disease like coronary heart disease, CHD. So we're going to just talk more about that here, but I hope that this kind of gives you a little bit more motivation about why this is important, but how in this video we're focusing on the threshold probability and how that impacts predictions, but machine learning model predicted probabilities are still very much a key role, but that's a whole other beast in and of itself. Here we're just saying that, okay, we assume we got the predicted probabilities from our prediction model, and we're acting on them based on our threshold probability. So that we have, this is our own preference, this is what we are preferring. So how accurate are our results, and what does it mean, how we are valuing, especially the two types of mistakes of false negatives versus false positives based on this threshold that we're using. How does that say something? Because this threshold can vary between 0 and 1. Just like any probability, it can vary. This can also be between 0 and 1 because it's a probability. And how does that give us some idea of how we weight false negatives versus false positives? And if you have like more questions, please do see my videos that I've created going over those. But that's just kind of like an overview of how machine learning model outputs predicted probability of having the disease. And we use a probability threshold, and we're changing it from the default of 50%. And that's what we're seeing, what that means here. So we're changing that, and then we're assigning patients to the positive, which is typically having disease if their predicted probability of having the disease, which is output from the machine learning model, if that's greater than or equal to the probability threshold. Otherwise, we predict negative, no disease, if the predicted probability of the disease is less than the threshold. So this is just a quick recap, so please do subscribe and see my other videos. We're going to push on with this foundation. And I go over those much more slowly and in depth in previous videos. So let's look at the probability threshold and how that impacts how we view the false positive FP versus the false negative mistakes. So these are the three different number lines here. Probability thresholds can be between 0 and 1. So when they are 50%, if your probability threshold is 50%, like a coin flip, then that means that, if you are assigned 50% and above, is your predicted probability of heart disease or any condition, then we predict that you have that. But if it's below that probability threshold, then we predict that you are negative, that you don't have the disease, like CHD. So whenever you are greater than or equal to the probability threshold, we predict that you are positive and that you have the condition. But whenever you're less than the probability threshold, then we predict you're negative. And these are predictions that are made, predicted probabilities that are made from machine learning models. So when the probability threshold is 50%, then false negative and false positive mistakes, they have the same impact, Yangshi. They both are equally bad. It's like a coin flip. That's what typically, we say for in predictive models for various applications. Typically, if it's greater than or equal to 50% for a predicted probability, we say it's a positive class. And if it's less than 50%, we say it's a negative class. Especially for medical decision making, the type of errors makes an impact. So if our probability threshold, it might not always be 50%, and that's what we talk about in decision curve analysis as well. It's very useful, especially when your probability threshold is not 50%. Let's say your probability threshold is 0% all the way to like 49.99999%. So it's greater than or equal to 0%, but less than 50%. Then that means that a false negative mistake is worse. So that means that, falsely saying that somebody has the disease, like CHD, is not as bad as not giving someone the treatment for CHD when they need it. Here, it's not here where we typically, like if you're above this, you are, here you're positive, and then here you're negative, predicted negative. It's that like if you're between here and here, we are then predicting you're positive, which is a greater range of probabilities. So here, false negatives are worse mistakes than false positive mistakes. That's why we really emphasize minimizing false negatives over false positives when the probability threshold is less than 50%. When it's equal to 50%, then both are equal type of errors, and we want to just minimize both wrong predictions of false negatives and false positives. On the other hand, if the probability threshold instead, if it is greater than 50%, then false positives are worse mistakes than false negatives. We try to minimize wrongly predicting someone as positive by increasing, going above and increasing to some extent, like hypothetically, like if this is the probability threshold, then this whole region here is negative, and then this whole region here would be positive. So we're like making it even harder to have a positive. So we are restricting the positives, the false positive mistakes that we're making, because we think that, sending someone for needless coronary heart disease treatment, who's healthy heart, who had a healthy heart, sending them for CHD treatment when they have a healthy heart is worse than not sending someone for CHD treatment if they had CHD. just to summarize, if the probability threshold is 50%, then both mistakes are equally bad. We have no preference. We just want to minimize both false negatives and false positives. But if the threshold is less than 50%, then false negatives are worse mistakes than false positives. And if the threshold is greater than 50%, then false positives are worse than false negative mistakes. So again, when we're making predictions for patients for like coronary heart disease or any disease in general, any condition, and again, you can apply this outside of healthcare or medical decision making. I do have some videos and examples about that, like for advertising fraud, for instance, or anything in general, anything you name it. So basically, the prediction again is predicting negative, like no coronary heart disease, if your predicted probability of having it is less than the threshold. Otherwise, you're positive and predicted as having CHD if your predicted probability, again, this is what we would call the p hat here. The p hat is just the predicted probability of the disease or anything in general is greater than or equal to the threshold, then you're predicted positive. Otherwise, you're predicted negative as not having it, considering that 1 means that you have it and 0 means that you do not have it, if you use that encoding. So again, based on that, the way that we interpret this again is, the default of 50%, which is typically used in most classification schemes, if you're greater than or equal to 50%, predict positive, otherwise predict negative. That's what typically is done. This direction is positive and including 50%. And then the other direction is typically negative in the prediction. Just for the sake of the colors, I'm going to change the colors. That's predicted negative. But as we vary them, what happens is, when the threshold probability is less than 50%, and of course it is a probability, it can only be between 0 and 1. If it's less than 50%, then what this typically just means, and this is not going up to 50%, it's less than that. So there's a greater range of probabilities where we would instead predict positive, because we have restricted this, we have lowered what this is. So since we decrease this, then it becomes much easier for us to predict positive. If this guy is lower, then we're going to be predicting positive even more often. So there's a greater range, everything else being the same. If we lower this threshold, we'll be predicting positive way more because we'll have a greater range here of probabilities where we predict positive versus negative. For instance, if this is our threshold, which is in this limit here, for instance, then all of this area here now is positive, and then just this tiny amount is negative, for instance, much smaller. So there's a greater range of probabilities where we predict positive than negative, and it's because somebody who has this probability threshold less than 50%, they don't care as much about false positives than they do about false negatives. They think false negatives are worse mistakes than false positives, so we can afford to decrease this threshold and predict positive more often, like to predict positive more often than negative, because that's what somebody with this threshold tends to value, is they tend to value false negatives as being worse than false positives. So with this being lower than 50% than the default, it just means that we could afford to make more false positive errors than false negatives. So the range of making any negatives here, of saying negative, is going to be like any false negative or true negative will be decreased, but the false positive or true positive, those types of outcomes would be increased instead. So instead here, now if we go here and we look at the false positive being worse than the false negative mistake, which is what happens if the probability threshold is greater than 50%, it just means, on the other hand, like let's say that we have our 75% here, And here though, this was like a 25%, just some number between 0 and 50%, not including 50%. So here let's just choose like 75%, for instance. So what this would mean is anything above this, and I'm going to predict positive, positive here, and anything below this, and I'm going to be predicting negative. So what we see here is, because if we increase this threshold, everything else being the same, we have less scope for having positive predictions. So we will not be making positive predictions as much, because so we have a greater range of probabilities where we predict negative over positive. Because why we're doing this is, it's because for us, having a false negative is not that bad as having a false positive. A false positive is a far worse mistake to people in this. They have made it so hard. They're raising the bar to become predicted positive. So you can see how strict, like the predicted probability is greater than or equal to 75%, for instance, then we predict positive. Otherwise we predict negative. So it's a greater range where we're predicting negative for patients. So even if they have a 75% chance of coronary heart disease in this situation, we are still gonna like see, okay, you have 75 and above, okay, yes, you have CHD. But if they had a 74% chance of CHD, of being positive, we will still say in this case, no, you don't have it, you're negative, you don't have the condition, you don't have the disease. Because we are so scared of falsely saying that, of making a false prediction that they have it when they don't have it, and sending them for unnecessary treatment. That's our fear. Our fear is a false positive. So even if we risk false negatives, where we wrongly predict that a patient with the disease does not have the disease, we made that wrong prediction, we are not as concerned, because we really are happier that we prevented somebody who is healthy from getting unnecessary treatment. Like, let's say that that's the priority here. But here in this priority, they're more scared of a false negative where you predict somebody does not have the condition but they actually have it, rather than unnecessarily predict somebody who's healthy has the condition and sending them for treatment. So in this situation, as you can see here, for any probability that, I just chose 75% here, I chose 25% here, just anything in this box here between this interval, all they will tell you is that, you'll see that there's a greater range of probabilities in this situation from here to here, where we predict negative versus positive. Positive is just a small little interval, and negative is so much larger here. And it's because, again, that we can afford to make more false negative errors. And of course, if these predictions here are correct, then we'll have like true negatives, right? And similarly here, if these predictions are correct, we'll have like true positives. But really, our key criteria here is to minimize false negatives in this case. And here it is to minimize false positives. So basically, this is just, again, how we can interpret this. Making a prediction for a patient for any disease, whether it's coronary heart disease or not, right? So I just wanted to show you that this can be for any disease, any condition, or even any application. When you have y equals 0 is typically, that's typically like y is, so that's typically like y equals 0 class. And this is typically the y equals 1 class. But if you change it up, then please just use this as a template and then adapt accordingly. And again, for the prediction for Purchi, again, I just wanted to show you that the predicted probability for the patient having the condition, that's what this P hat represents. That's what this is. And again, this is the worst case scenario. If we had to make mistakes, what would we prefer? So if our threshold is 50%, we have no preference. If it's less than 50%, we would rather make more false positives than false negatives. And if it's greater than 50%, we would rather instead make more false negatives than false positive mistakes. So in general, my approach is to explain in many different ways till something sinks in for you guys. So whichever way it takes for the concepts to sink in, soak in, absorb. So that's why I'm trying to present a few different ways of interpreting or thinking of this. just to summarize, right? Like, so we're not perfect, neither is our machine learning model or predictions. We wish they could be, but that's something we're working on, right? And in other videos, I'll talk about how to make a better predictive models and how different tools to do that. But the thing that we have to ask ourselves when we're looking at this and we're thinking, and we have a model that's outputting predicted probabilities of having the condition, or the disease. And sometimes it can be 0 or 1, but that usually uses a default of 50%. So really, when you're doing this, you want to ideally have a machine learning model that's outputting predicted probabilities. Because if it's assigning a class, chances are that it's using the default of 50%, because that's what's typically used in a lot of applications. In a lot of applications, typically they just use this threshold of 50%, and then they assign you to positive if you are greater than or equal to 50% as your predicted probability, and negative if you have a predicted probability less than 50%. So, but in this case now, we have to make mistakes in our machine learning models and in our predictions. What would we prefer, right? This is just summarizing what we talked about here. So it's all about, what would we prefer if we have to make mistakes? What is the lesser of two evils, right? And the key word is prefer. And what prefer here means the probability threshold that we have. And that's why I'm saying to make sure your machine learning models output predicted probabilities, not just, predicting 0 or 1, disease or not disease, because you want that preference. You want the ability to decide. Maybe you stick with 50%, maybe you don't, right? But you want to have the ability to have predicted probabilities that are returned to you. You want these p hats returned to you, predicted probability for the condition. You want that power. So then you can decide based on your probability threshold. So this is sort of like thinking in the worst case again, like if you had to make mistakes, what would you prefer? So this is cute. It's like, what's this? Oh, I'm just rehearsing the worst case scenario here. And this little kid is like, what's this? Being in a coffin, for instance. And somebody here is talking about, the worst case scenarios, being attacked by, some villains here. They're showing, oh, of course, this is just a worst case scenario. So basically, let's just see what the threshold tells you, what your preferences tell you. Again, so, probability threshold, as any probability, can be between 0 and 1 or 0 and 100%. So if your threshold probability is between 0 and 50%, but it's less than, so it's greater than or equal to 0, but less than 50%. So basically, if it's less than 50%, you rather have more false positive errors than false negative errors, since false negatives are much worse than false positives in your opinion. So if you had to make mistakes, you would prefer them to be false positives instead of false negatives. And again, this is the default. The default is, 50%. Then you have no preferences. Both errors are equally bad. You just want both to be, really small. And in these situations, you do want to make, like, even if false negatives are worse than false positives, you don't want to make unnecessary false positives. You just want to reduce the errors that you're making overall for all these approaches. We want as few errors as possible, but if we had to choose which error we want to minimize over the other, in this case, we would want to minimize have fewer false negatives and over false positive if they asked us to choose, right? So we would want fewer false negative errors, even at the risk of more false positive errors. And here we just don't have any preference. If we have a model, that gives fewer in both, we're okay with that. But here, if we have, then this comes down to, how much worse is a false positive or a false negative, or how much worse in this case is a false negative to a false positive when you're deciding between models. And that's what decision curve analysis, which I talk about in many videos in my playlist, please subscribe and see, is very helpful. And here, if your threshold probability is greater than 50 but less than 100%, then if you had to make errors, you would prefer to make more false negative errors than false positives, because you believe that false positives are much worse than false negatives, because already you've made it really strict to predict positive. You've raised the bar so high because you don't want to unnecessarily predict positive. Like, you're really making the criteria so strict because you don't want a false positive. And again, in all these cases, you do want to have as few false positive and false negative errors. But if somebody were to ask you to choose which you would want to restrict, then this is the what you would tell them based on your probability threshold. So again, less than 50%, you'd say, I want to minimize false negatives. I'm not too concerned about false positives, so please don't give me false negatives as much as possible. Please try to reduce that. If it's 50%, no preference, just please reduce both. And if, it's greater than 50%, you're like, I'd rather take false negative errors, but I really don't want false positive. Please reduce that. But overall, please try to cut down the false negative and false positives. But this is sort of my game plan for the ideal model. So basically, if you're looking at the probability threshold again, how would you interpret it? So, as I was mentioning, based on the formula, right? So anytime your probability threshold is less than 50%, then you're essentially saying that a false negative is worse than a false positive, and that proportion will be based on that calculation of PT over or minus PT. Um, What you see here as well is that this is the default in a lot of different tasks. This is the default. Here, if you have this, a lot of predictive models use 50% as the threshold to assign to the positive class and negative class. So again, for anything that is greater than or equal to the probability threshold, then you assign to the positive class, and anything that is less than the probability threshold, you assign to the negative class. So what that is again is, in other words, this is the predicted probability of coronary heart disease for the patient. P with a little like a accent on top, like a P hat. So it's a predicted probability of CHD for patient. This comes from the predictive model. Again, the predictive model has, the logistic or the complex one or the simple one, or it could be any other model like support vector machine, anything at all that gives a predicted probability of coronary heart disease. So the predicted class for the patient is positive, which is CHD, coronary heart disease, if the predicted probability of CHD for the patient is greater than or equal to the threshold that you have, your probability threshold. Otherwise, it's negative, so no CHD, if the predicted probability is below this threshold. So adjusting this threshold will adjust the predictions and the outcomes. So if typically we use 50% as the cutoff and defaults in predictive models, but if you adjust this so that it's below 50%, the threshold, like anywhere between 0 and 50%, and less than 50%, then you're saying that a false negative is worse than a false positive. So the ideal model would focus on having fewer false negatives, so being less strict about predicting the positive class, because those are the worst types of errors. So it's focusing on fewer false negatives because it thinks that false negatives are worse than false positives. So I'd rather just be less strict and have a lot more people go to the positive class. So it's kind of like a scale between 0 and 100%. So the lesser the probability threshold is than 50%, that means that you're assigning way more people to the positive class, like the chances are going up in a way. So in a way, you don't care as much if it's a false positive because you really want to avoid a false negative as much as possible. So you want to minimize that. So that's what you're trying to do when you have this, that even if somebody has a 30% chance of cancer or coronary heart disease or severe COVID or whatnot, you're still going to send them for treatment because there's a 30% chance. To you, it's like seeing the glass half empty versus half full. It's like, to you, is a 30% chance of them being in harm, and you want to minimize that as much as possible. So there's a 30% chance that they could have it. That's what you think about. So you don't want to avoid treatment for them if they have it. Like, that's what you're really scared about. You don't care if they didn't have it and they went through unnecessary treatment. Like, that's not as bad to you as them missing out on potential life-saving treatment if they do have it. And our goal is to make predictive models that are so accurate with this that in a way we can just blindly go with them. But sadly, science and math and machine learning takes some time to get there, and we need more data. But on the other hand, so if they're equal, that means that an ideal model would just focus on having the smallest number of false positive and false negative errors overall, and like looking at accuracy and other things. But if your probability threshold is greater than 50%, what that means is between 50 and 100%. Then on the other hand, it just flipped around. It just means that false positives are much worse than false negatives. So the ideal model would focus on having fewer false positives. So it's going to be very strict about predicting or assigning people to the positive class. 50% doesn't cut it anymore. Maybe they need a 60% chance of having cancer or CHD or so for you to assign them for treatment. So in this view, the model will focus on having fewer false positives, and it's strict about sending people to for treatment. Maybe this is like in COVID severity, where the ICUs, intensive care units, are limited, and you just don't want to assign everyone to the ICU just like that, because you want to only have the most severe people going there. So maybe your threshold will be like, for predicting COVID severity, could be like even like 75%. Maybe then you send them to the ICU and give them ventilators, for instance. That could change in that situation. So in this case, it focus on having fewer false positives, because those are the worst types of errors, because they are so strict about sending people to the positive class that way. So it's not just, between 0 and 50, it's more towards, it's a smaller chance, because it's like less than 50% chance that you'd be in the positive class according to this threshold. More if it's devoted to the negative class, because they and assigning people there, because they're really scared here about having false positives, like incorrectly predicting someone has disease when they don't. And again, while I personally feel like this in medical decision making, it's totally fine, and I respect your opinion, and I think it's totally natural based on your situations and circumstances, like for COVID severity, for instance, or if there are resource issues or other things in your life, if you want to prioritize this error. It really depends situation to situation. But that's what these probability thresholds mean, and implicitly we sometimes do it without thinking sometimes, and that's what decision curve analysis is picking up on, the fact that sometimes we know at some point maybe we'll go for treatment if we not if we have a 19% chance, but a 20% chance of cancer. Like, where do you draw the line? Like, what is that threshold upon which you're like, okay, I'm going for treatment for this? Like, if you have a 3% chance of cancer, who, God forbid, no, but like 3% chance, 4% chance, 5, like at what point do you go? And if we can use that information, we can better understand how you weigh these different mistakes. Like, if you go for 5% chance of cancer, then you're only focused on, what if that 5% chance I have cancer and I don't get treated, versus a 95% chance that you don't. So you're so scared of a false negative, then so you're going with such a low threshold. So these are all the interpretations of this, and that's how decision curve analysis kind of use your risk preference indirectly to say that in your mind you do some cost benefit analysis using the information that you have available in your life. Like, you make a decision and then you kind of focus on like reverse engineering and figuring out what that decision says about your relative preferences for false negatives and false positives. Thank you guys, and please subscribe. Toggle, toggle, toggle says to please subscribe. Hi, toggle. Meow, meow. Do you like my channel? Meow. He likes it. Toggle. So I hope that this was really helpful to help you guys just understand this intuition. I'm Saniya Kuller, and if you found this helpful, just please like. Also, please subscribe. Please see my other videos on decision curve analysis and on building upon this intuition. But overall, I just wanted to show you about probability thresholds, what they say about your preferences, and how this is a way to go if you want to sort of control the outcomes. Because one of the ways we talked about was making sure you have really strong machine learning models. And then the other way that we control these outcomes is by the probability threshold. So there are many more videos to come. So thank you for watching this.
Thank you guys for watching. I'm cuddling with cute little Yankee here.
And again, please subscribe.